Firstly, we're going to go through the reasons why people do select local provenance for plantings. And the number one that came up, and you might remember the first four are pretty much a dead heat, but the top one at the moment is conserving genetic biodiversity. That is, biodiversity comprises three different levels really: the communities that organisms make up, their species, and the genetics that are held within each species. So in any local environment, there is a particular gene pool of a particular species, and if we bring in genes from elsewhere, that's going to change the makeup of the local gene pool. Have we lost something? Now, we might need the microphone over for the panel, I think, or perhaps the panel can also come up to the lectern if they prefer. There's those two options, but I'll throw it over to the panel. How much concern do people have to have about loss of genetic diversity at the local scale? Because at local scale, our local genes are providing biodiversity that makes up a little bit of the global biodiversity. Who would like to cover that?
So you're not talking about local adaptation here, you're talking about actual genetic diversity.
That's right, yes. So we talk about conserving biodiversity, we conserve the communities, we conserve the species, we want to conserve the species, the genetic variation within each species, and that varies from one location to another.
So, I mean, the first thing to, I guess, point out is that genetic diversity really depends on the size of the population. So when you have a large population, you basically have a lot of diversity, assuming that population's been large for a long period of time. As soon as population size decreases, you start losing diversity. And in some ways, we've had some undesirable outcomes when we have conserved a lot of genetic diversity across populations, because often we actually conserve very small populations that might be genetically distinct, but they are actually quite inbred. And the data, there's a bit of data on plants on that, there's more data on animals. And I should just point out also that the issues we are talking about today are also relevant to animals, and they are being discussed quite actively at the moment. So the whole issue about local provenancing in animals is also important. You know, should we take bandicoots from Tasmania and cross them to Victorian ones, for instance? So it is a broader issue that also includes the fauna as well as the flora. So I think in some cases you will have small populations that you're conserving and you might have undesirable outcomes. Of course, in other cases, you have some populations that are healthy and are local, and they actually capture some nice genetic variation, and you do want to conserve those. So I think it's not a black and white issue. It really depends on the situation. But I would certainly advocate, when you've got a population that's been small for a long time, and you're losing diversity, then you may find that from an evolutionary point of view, from a future adaptation point of view, that population is not going to be particularly important.
Sorry, so the thing I was just trying to say is 2 points. Firstly, we should be talking about animals as much as we're talking about plants. And some of the best evidence we have about basically adverse outcomes in terms of conserving local variation is in animal populations. So people, for instance, in many cases have conserved very small animal populations. There are also some cases in plants, and they don't have much genetic diversity. They might be genetically unique, but they don't capture much genetic diversity. So when you think about genetic diversity, if you've got a small population that historically has been small for a long time, then you're going to lose a lot of the variation present in that population. That population will then potentially become inbred. You're going to get deleterious alleles, in other words, alleles that have a bad effect on fitness, becoming common in those populations, and that's going to affect the overall fitness of those populations. So population size is critical, and sometimes local populations will have been small, and then they're less valuable than local populations that have been big for a long period of time. So you sort of have to take, if you like, the historical context into perspective as well, and that's critically important. And in Australia, we have many cases where small populations have actually become problematical. You know, we have grevilleas with small population size has had a major impact and leading to inbreeding, and basically you've lost the ability of those populations to have sex. And sex, of course, is good for many things, but one of the things it's really good for is generating genetic variation. In animals, we've also seen some populations crash. They've become inbred. You get the expression of these traits that are pretty undesirable, and as a consequence, those populations have a very, very low fitness. Those are the ones you don't want to conserve. So I think it's important to put local conservation in perspective and make sure that when you are conserving that genetic diversity locally, it's a part of a large population gene pool.
Is there anyone else on the panel who would like to contribute something?
I might just add a minor point to what Ari just said, although he covered it all. But the other interesting thing about inbreeding and the issues of having too little genetic diversity is to consider the temporal thing. So as Ari was mentioning, in the short term, if a population has low genetic diversity, that is likely to decrease the fitness of that population. Keeping in mind that plants are a bit special, and there are plants that can be clonal, there are plants that can self, so inherently they have low genetic diversity within a population. That's when the long-term effect of inbreeding can come into effect, and that is that when the environmental conditions, we talk about climate all the time, climate is just an example. It can be a new disease coming in, it can be new competition, but when the environmental conditions change, then the spectrum, the amount of diversity within that population with low genetic diversity, that inbred population, self-population, clonal population, might not be sufficient to respond to those changes.
Thank you. Now, we're going to deal with inbreeding and outbreeding presently. The idea of this particular thing, the top reason is about the concept of conserving our local gene pool as distinct from another one, and that's related perhaps to inbreeding, and they're very valid points that have just been made, but we will be dealing with inbreeding and outbreeding depression presently.